This is Boxman, and he's been learning to draw in perspective. Yeah! But he's not that good at it. At least, not yet. You see, he thinks that perspective is too complicated. But it doesn't have to be. It can be, and at times, it might be. But I'm convinced that anyone can learn. Yes, even you, Boxman. So when it comes to drawing in perspective, I like to say that there are two ways of going about things, two ways to approach a drawing in perspective. And in this video, I want to explain what these are, because if you are an artist looking to learn, then this is good to know. But first of all, I need to confess. The reason why Boxman thinks perspective is confusing is, well, it's because of me. I'm his teacher, and last year we had started to make some videos for a series we called Advanced Perspective. And I'll explain what we were doing in those videos soon, but as the name suggests, it's advanced. Those aren't necessarily made for beginners, and Boxman was just that. He was a beginner. That's why he eventually gave up. I made the mistake of introducing him to a lot of what can be complicated concepts, and as a result I scared him off. It was too early in the day to be learning about that stuff when he had yet to understand the basic principles of perspective. Boxgal, can you change the music please? Anyways, I did make it up to Boxman by starting a new perspective drawing guide made for beginners. A series I called Simple Perspective, and up to now he's been doing quite well. Although I do have a habit of going in depth when it comes to explaining things. Sometimes this can overwhelm him. The reason I mention my two perspective drawing guides being Simple Perspective and Advanced Perspective is because each of these present a different way to approach a drawing in perspective. Now whilst a lot of what's covered in each of these still applies and folds into one another, I like to make a distinction because a beginner, like Boxman, could be misled into thinking that perspective drawing is too complicated and not for them, when really it can be as complicated as you want it to be. So what's the difference between simple perspective and advanced perspective? And what are these two ways of drawing in perspective? Here is a well-known book called Perspective Made Easy. This was originally published in 1939, but it stood the test of time because, as the title suggests, it takes a subject like perspective and it teaches it in a simple and easy to understand way. And that's my intention with Simple Perspective. I'm trying to explain everything in a way that can be easily understood. And Boxman is a great way to gauge how successful I am at doing that because he's, well, what do you say, not the sharpest tool in the shed. Anyways, this is a good book and one that covers a lot of ground when it comes to perspective. The things I will be covering in Simple Perspective, but the reason I'm showing you this is because if you flip towards the end of the book, when it's assumed that the reader has now gained a better sense and understanding of the basics, there is a section called Mechanical Perspective, and it says this.
Up until now, we have been learning about perspective as we would use it in sketching and freehand drawing. We will now learn something about mechanical perspective that is used in the more exacting sciences of drawing.
Mechanical perspective, what he refers to as a science of drawing, is what I cover in my Advanced Perspective series. I think the term mechanical is used due to all of the drawing tools that are often needed when drawing this way. Tools such as a ruler, compass, protractor, sometimes a set square. I've also heard this way of drawing referred to as formal perspective. You know, it's not for everyone, it's definitely more niche when it comes to learning how to draw. Now you're probably stood there or sat there with just a pencil at your disposal thinking, why would I want to go to the effort of having to use all of these tools to draw? You know, how do you benefit from drawing this way? Well, if you're not drawing this way, then you're probably taking a less formal and more intuitive approach to drawing in perspective. Perhaps you are sketching and drawing freehand, and you are using your own visual judgment to draw objects in perspective. You still require at least a basic understanding of perspective and the principles involved to be able to do this successfully, but you aren't as concerned with being exact. And you can't be, right? If you are relying on your own eyes and intuition to draw in perspective, then yeah, in terms of accuracy, you can get close enough, which is fine for the purpose of a drawing, but your drawings will never be as accurate as they can be when taking the more mechanical and formal approach. I just want to jump in here and say that the purpose of being able to draw in perspective for most artists is to have the ability to create convincing spaces or to draw objects that appear three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface. As long as your drawings can be understood in a way that makes sense, then you are succeeding at drawing in perspective. So this is the starting point for most beginners who are wanting to learn, and I'll assume that most of you watching are familiar with the basics of perspective. The things that are involved in drawing this way, things like the horizon line and vanishing points. These are simple concepts which are introduced to beginners early on. I say simple, but I know that these can still confuse some people, but they are simple in comparison to what's involved when it comes to mechanical perspective, which I'll briefly go over here. Before I get into this though, there are a lot of benefits and cool things you can do when approaching a drawing this way. It's not just about being accurate and drawing perfectly square boxes. For example, early on in my Advanced Perspective series, I use this analogy that as an artist you are like the director of a movie scene. You get to control the camera and capture the subject however you please. Now if you've been on a mission to learn perspective, then you've probably come across what people refer to as the viewer, right? When we draw in perspective, we imagine what we are drawing from the point of view of a person, the viewer. But in my Advanced Perspective series, I suggest swapping out the viewer to instead imagine a camera. And then you are drawing what that camera sees through its lens. This is a different mode of thinking that aligns nicely with that director analogy. And this is something I learned when reading Scott Robertson's How to Draw book. Another great book, by the way, but probably not the best introduction to perspective for beginners. Because in this book he covers a lot of what's involved in formally setting up a drawing in perspective. Things like the cone of vision, for example. He explains how the cone of vision and the degree of that cone emulates a camera lens with a specific focal length. For example, a 60-degree cone of vision that is commonly used for most drawings in perspective is close to what is seen through a standard lens with a 35mm focal length. Also, as I mentioned in a simple perspective video, a 60-degree cone of vision closely resembles a person's eyes. We have a limited field of view, but a camera doesn't have those limitations because we can just change the lens. Which means we also have that ability when drawing. We can use a larger cone of vision to emulate a wide-angle lens, or a smaller cone of vision to emulate what would be more like a telephoto lens. Now call me a nerd, but I think that's quite cool, and for me, learning how to draw this way is worth it. That's why I made the effort to explain how to do that in my Advanced Perspective series. You can also do a lot more, but I'll just let you go watch those videos if you're interested. So those are the two ways of drawing in perspective, and I now have two separate playlists on YouTube that covers each of them. As I said earlier though, what you learn in one does still apply to the other. It's more so a case of how far do you want to go with it. How deep down the rabbit hole are you willing to go? I mentioned the cone of vision and these other concepts in my Simple Perspective course because I think it's good to at least be aware of these things, and well, that was the purpose of this video. Now this wasn't a proper Simple Perspective video, but because I think that beginners should know about all of this, I'm going to place it within that same playlist. Think of it as a side dish to the main meal. And I promise all of you, when it comes to Simple Perspective, you're going to be eating good. Anyways, thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.